When my son was 7 years old, we undertook a project of reading novels about mice. Now, in one of the novels, The Tale of Despero, the heroine mouse becomes a human, or befriends a human, a princess no less. And despite insurmountable odds of being rejected by the other mice, betrayed by his own brother, and banished from the mouse community, Despero mounts a courageous endeavor to rescue the princess when she gets locked by somebody else down in the dungeon of the castle. Armed with no more than his courage, love for the princess, and a sewing needle, Despero sets out to free her. And in the midst of my reading the story aloud, my son hopped up from the chair and began to engage in an imaginary duel in the living room. And this is really something for an Anabaptist who's a pacifist, but an imaginary duel in the living room, and his body lunged forth and back and forth as he stood in a sword-fighting pose with his sewing needle. He was now the courageous Despero who would come to the aid of another despite being treated terribly. His eyes lit up as he tumbled around the room, and I kept reading, matching my voice to the intensity of the story. See, a story not only says, a story embodies. See, the invitation is not only that we will follow the story, but that we'll join the story. We are an embodied people. The Word did not become Word. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. See, it's one thing to repeat a story. It's another thing when the story and the teller become one. This is the challenge of the preacher. This is the challenge of a worship gathering, and this is the challenge of the church. The Word did not become Word and dwell among us. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. I invite you into another story, an alternate hearing of the gospel in John chapter 13. The disciples and Jesus are gathered together, and the disciples still aren't getting the notion of what it means to lead in the way of Jesus. Instead, they're arguing amongst themselves. I get the right. No, you get the right. No, what are you mumbling amongst yourselves? What are you arguing about? And they're not getting it. And it's a wonder that Jesus just didn't give up and say, okay, I tried for 3 years. I think we need to scrap this idea and start over with somebody else. Instead, in this alternate reading, Jesus sits back and says, okay, hypothetically speaking, let's just say I got up from the table. Let's just say I did that. And I came over to you and I tried to wash your feet, Peter, kind of like the servant did when you walked in the room. What would you think of that, Peter? And Peter would kind of say, I don't know. I think it'd be kind of weird. I don't know. Chances are the disciples still would not have gotten it. They could have stayed and would have stayed in their places of control, and they wouldn't have got the kind of leadership that Jesus was talking about. If we remove embodiment, the story completely changes. The Word did not become Word and dwelled among us. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. See, instead, Jesus teaches, he preaches, he leads through the body. Jesus interrupts the storyline of the disciples on a visceral level, leaving little room for ignoring the transformation of Jesus-centered leadership called forth into the world. He even says, unless you let me wash your feet, you will have no part of me. Don't stand on the sidelines. Become part of me and let me wash your feet. The teller and the tail become one. This is messy leadership from below. Let me wash your feet and have you enter into what I've been trying to say all along. And having a part in Jesus and as a leader under Christ's way meant entering into something that the imagination couldn't grasp apart from embodiment. Now their bodies immediately knew the lesson that the rest of their beings were still wrapping their minds around. In fact, Jesus even said, your mind's not going to get this until later. But their bodies knew. And for Peter, something deeper was being rooted inside of him to prepare him. The Word did not become Word. The Word became flesh and dwelled among us. So what does this mean for preaching? Number one, the goal is not merely to read the scriptures, but to have the scriptures read us. Number two, the initial step is that our exegetical work of letting the scriptures read us is not to happen all alone. Gather the group that's working with the whole worship gathering and have them help you exegete. It will transform in time that worship gathering. Number three, recognize that God's story is told in the whole of the worship gathering. And number four, find ways to help the gathered community enact the story. For the Word became flesh and dwelled among us. So you didn't think I was going to let you leave without using your body just a little bit in this. In the history of the church, one of the ways in which the baptismal candidates were being prepared and being blessed was through a blessing of the senses. That they would come in the midst of the gathered church and have their senses of eyes and ears and mouth blessed with the sign of the cross. This is an opening of the body. Now, instead of blessing the senses, we are going to bless one another's feet. In Isaiah 52:7, how beautiful upon the mountains are the feet of the messenger who announces peace, who brings good news, who announces salvation, and who says to Zion, your God reigns. And this is mentioned again in Romans 10:5. How beautiful are the feet of you who bring good news. Just in a couple moments here, I ask that you find one other person, or at the most, in a cluster of 3, and simply bend down and touch the feet of the person and say, blessed are your feet, for they bring good news. And in turn, have your partner also.
Blessed are your